All right. We have been talking about how we know what we know. How we know what we know. We started with a kind of philosophical exploration of that, and then last week moved into an example of a relationship as portrayed in An Ideal Husband by Oscar Wilde in order to see what those dynamics actually looked like. The kind of fundamental theme has been that knowing is a personal thing. That to really know anything, we have to be in relationship with that thing. When in the context of that relationship, we may gather information, we may manipulate that information, we may work through to a conclusion, but it's always guided by a relationship. It's always guided by a relationship. So we left last week with one of my favorite lines from Miss Mabel to Lord Goring. Do you remember this line? When she says, there's a difference between looking and seeing. There's a difference between looking and seeing. He, in a somewhat smooth and self-aware way, has just said he hadn't seen anything that he liked yet. And she was responding very sharply and said, there's a difference between looking and seeing. To look at something is to see the beauty in it. To look at something is to see the beauty in it, which is the essence of what I've been saying about knowing being a personal, relational thing, right? When I talk about our baptismal covenant and respecting the dignity of every human being, respect in its root means look again, which is to say keep looking at whatever you're looking at, be it a rock or your neighbor, until you see the beauty in it, until you see the presence of God there. Now, this is not a new thought. In fact, in what is probably one of the most famous sermons the Buddha ever rendered, which is called the Silent Sermon, he picked up a lotus flower surrounded by his disciples and gazed at it, which is to say, stared at it without saying anything. A long time went by, and you can imagine the kind of nervous throat clearing and movement as people tried to figure out what in the world he was doing. And finally, one disciple smiled, and he is said to be the only disciple that understood the sermon, which is to look into the beauty of the flower, a task which has no utilitarian value per se, is to know everything you need to know about yourself and the world. To truly see the beauty of that flower is to know everything you need to know about yourself and the world. This was the origin of Zen Buddhism and contemplation. So a very old idea. And it's not that it's gone away either. There is a poet who I like called David Whyte. Do you know David Whyte? He's a poet and a philosopher. He and John Donahue were very close friends. John Donahue was a philosopher and a poet. This is their personal joke. Nevertheless, David Whyte, who grew up part Irish and part from Yorkshire, which is where the Industrial Revolution began, was watching TV as a child and saw Jacques Cousteau, the inventor of the aqualung, on his boat Calypso, following dolphin across the ocean. And he thought at that very moment, I didn't know they would pay you to do that. And so he threw away his poetry and he enrolled in as much chemistry and science and physics as he could find, and he emerged being a scientist. He was dispatched to the Galapagos, where he spent hours watching plants and birds. Those of you who've been to the Galapagos know that's what you do there, right? The string of islands that Darwin discovered, where many of the species are literally only there, but you can kind of see the evolutionary development of things by looking at the older islands and comparing them to the younger islands. It's a fascinating journey. So David Whyte spent his time there, and he developed what he called the conversational nature of reality. The conversational nature of reality. What he said is that he realized that the science that he had been taught was spending a lot of time trying to get the I out of the picture. Trying to get the I out of the picture. That is to say, look at things objectively and from a distance, treating them as information only. And he realized you could never get to the depth of nature. You could never really understand, study, and learn from nature if you didn't enter into a relationship with it, right? The conversational nature of reality. You can see, I hope, this is the very same thing the Buddha was talking about, the very same thing that Oscar Wilde was talking about, the very same thing I think that Jesus talks over and over again about. It's cool, George, but so what? Thank you. It's been nice. If you believe that to be true, or trust me enough to accept that it might be true, then how do you learn how to be in relationship with other people, or with nature, or with a rock? Right? I've quoted Cynthia Bourgeault, a wisdom teacher and Episcopal priest, before, when she was challenged by one of her wisdom school students. He said, how could you be an Episcopal priest? How could you say those things your ordination vows require you to say, that everything necessary for salvation is contained in Scripture? You don't believe that. And she said, I do believe that. I also believe it's contained in a rock. This is a lot like Zen Buddhism, isn't it? She's just frustrating your literal thought process. In other words, God is in everything. Remember the myth I was telling you about creation out of the Jewish contemplative tradition. The spark of God is in everything, and so to pay attention to anything is to pay attention to God. And that path will lead you to an understanding of God, not only in that thing, but in yourself and in the world. So it's all about relationships. It's all about relationships. And so I think the calling to us as Christians was, how do we engage in relationships? What practices might we follow? What things might we look at? And what I'm going to argue today is the world, which seems to need some help, the help might start here in our learning how to be in relationship without fear. We come to church, I think, to learn how to be in relationship without fear. How can we do that? I'm going to argue that our practices in church are in fact designed to do that, and that the community we build and exercise here, whether it's at the communion rail or in the parking lot listening to jazz music and chill on the hill, is all about that. Those are all practices. Let's go back to David White. So I know this is too long for you to read, but it's helpful for me to be able to read it to you and for the podcast. So David White says, I went back to poetry because I felt scientific language wasn't precise enough. I love that. I went to poetry because scientific language wasn't precise enough to describe what I'd experienced in the Galapagos. Science is rightly trying to remove the I. Nobody is saying that science isn't valuable. Nobody is saying that we shouldn't do it, right? Science is interested in removing the I, but in the Galapagos, I began to realize that because I was in deeply attentive states, hour after hour, watching animals and birds and landscapes, that's all I did for almost 2 years, I began to realize that my identity depended not upon any beliefs that I had, inherited or manufactured. My identity depended upon how much attention I was paying to things that were other than myself. My identity depended on how much attention I was paying to things other than myself. Can you get a sense of when you've been in that state or disposition, so captivated by what you were paying attention to that you forgot about yourself? And if you can remember one of those circumstances, whether it was on the golf course or on the fishing stream or in the kitchen or in the nursery or the delivery room for that matter, what brought you out of it? Do you remember? Think for a minute. First, recall that moment. You're so captivated by what you're paying attention to, you forget about you, and then you lose it. What brought you out of it? Fear? Yes. Well, how else would you describe that moment? Thoughts and language, yes. Right, thoughts, yeah. Thoughts and fear, what else do you remember? There's no wrong answer, it's your experience, yeah. Seeing the clock, okay. Right, right. Seeing the clock, Chronos time, not Kairos time, yeah. Learning how to communicate, yeah. You remember I told the story last week of Annie Dillard and the muskrats in the Tinker at Pilgrim Creek, how she has to work to be present so that they will come out and engage her, yes. What else? Yes, sir. Hubris? We must have been together, Randy. Yeah, so what's common to all these answers, which are all right, is us, right? We become aware of ourselves, our fear, our thoughts, our hubris, our tasks, right? And once we're back in the middle of it, we lose that transcendent moment. Right? So when you think back about our practices, whether it's in church or reading scripture or meditating or in service, when we're closest to God is often when we have forgotten about ourselves on purpose. Right? Forgotten about ourselves on purpose. Now, why is all this important? This is all important because the I in these examples, I think, is really our egos. Not a bad thing, ego. Ego's a tough word because it gets used so many different ways. It's just our way of projecting ourselves into the world. But what happens with our ego, no matter who we are, is we tend to identify it with something else. And identify means to make the same as. So we tend to identify ourself with what other people say or what we've achieved, or what we possess. Those are Nouwen's descriptions, Henry Nouwen. But you can think about Jesus and the temptations in the wilderness. What the Satan is inviting Jesus to do is identify himself with, become the same as these various exercises of power, all of which are expressions of self. So the larger our ego gets and the more identified it becomes with something in our lives, the less room for God there is. Because in identifying with whatever that thing is, and by the way, it could be your spiritual maturity, right? The truth is, as we grow in our spiritual maturity, we just become that much more savvy in what we use to bolster our egos. And in many cases, it becomes even harder to forget yourself on purpose, right? But that's the spiritual path. How do we let go of whatever we've identified ourselves with, which has the effect of opening us to the rest of life, other people, nature, God. Almost all of our spiritual practices, whether it's meditation or service or communion, are designed at some level to invite you to let go or encourage you to let go of your own fears, of your own worry about identity. Right? Who will I be if this goes that way? Who will I be if my son does the other? It can happen in a million ways, which is why there isn't a set of rules that can capture everything, right? Knowing is about acquiring wisdom. Yes, we acquire information. Yes, we know about rules. Yes, we understand principles that we follow of leadership or otherwise. But fundamentally, what we're trying to gain in community is wisdom. Right? How do we know what to do when? And I think we gain that only in relationship. If we do not have empathy for another person, if we're not in touch with our compassion, if we don't know what sympathy feels like, I don't think we can be wise. Does that make sense? Now, it took me a while because acquiring information sounds very attractive to me. Gaining knowledge sounds very attractive to me. But what happens? You wind up just wandering around proving how smart you are all the time. And what is that? Identification with something. What other people say about you or what you've achieved or what you possess. See how that works? There are an infinite variety of ways that we can become identified with something in the world, some other created object, and in doing so lose sight of God. So faith is this constant movement between being focused on God and having room in our hearts for the presence of God and aligning ourselves with that and living out of that and projecting our own ego and acting in service of it. We call that idolatry in the church. That's what idolatry is. That identification with something else, with the idol. And often we'll identify something that other people are identified with and point it out, right? Well, they're all tied up in money. I'm not all tied up in money, right? Their social status governs their lives. Thank God I'm not that way. What? Now you've identified with poverty. No difference. It's simply an expression of ego. See how that works? It's unbelievably creative, and it never stops, which is another reason why being in community is so rewarding. Because the better you get to know other people, the more they can help you learn about yourself and how you do this. Right? I've kind of talked through this in the context of marriage before. That incremental growth in intimacy and trust that allows you to hear the critique or loving invitation that your partner offers. Because you are constantly trying to do things to bolster your ego, which are getting in the way of God's presence. Okay. I really think at the end it is that simple and that difficult. And our way of knowing, how we know what we know, is in large part kind of addressing the illusion that building up the ego creates. Right? Because if you can get behind the illusion, it'll take care of itself. So when I'm saying open yourself up, largely what I'm saying is be awake is how it's described in the spiritual traditions. Awareness, be awake. Be awake. Because once you can see what's happening, it doesn't work anymore. It's like a magician's trick. Once you know how the magician did something, you're not so wowed by it. You can be respectful of the skill. You can enjoy the performance. But you're not so wowed by it because it's a trick. And so the life of faith is in large part dispelling the illusions that our ego and supportive ego generate. Okay. This is what White is talking about. When he's talking about being in solitude hours and hours and in, totally focused on something else, what's happening to his ego? It's shrinking. He's not paying attention to him. You're out on an island. Who cares about you? That's exactly what Annie Dillard does on that bridge when she ceases to exist, which invites the muskrats to come out. Those are all the functions of spiritual practices, but fundamentally, however you do it, it's getting out of the way so that God can be present. And the more you can get out of the way, the more you can see the beauty in another person where God is already present. Does that make sense? So when the look and see line that Minnie Driver offers is consistent with the silent sermon that Buddha offers, which is consistent with this conversational nature of reality that David White is offering. It's all the same experience. How do I get out of the way so the presence of God can have some room? And when that happens, I wind up seeing other people differently, my backyard differently. All right. He says, I began to realize that my identity depended not upon any beliefs I'd inherited. I've not identified with a belief. Remember, I distinguish between knowing about God from knowing God. Beliefs are very helpful as long as they're guiding you into relationship. But when they become the thing that you're identified with, what do you do with them? Well, not Episcopalians, because we really don't have many beliefs, but other people. right? I mean, what do they do with them? They use them to exclude. They use them over against. They use them to fuel coercive power. Because that's what our ego does. Because our ego is afraid of death, always. Right? This is the insight of Ernest Becker in his book, Denial of Death. We are, at some level, afraid of death. And yet the spiritual life calls us into a form of death by letting go of your ego, as Christ did ultimately on the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me? Our traditional understanding of that moment it is such a loss of self that he feels totally abandoned even by God. Totally abandoned even by God, though he is the Son of God. So the path of following Christ is a path of letting go of your ego. The path of following Christ is a path of constantly getting smaller so that God can be larger. And that's what David White realizes when he's sitting on these islands in the Galapagos. I'm paying attention to things that are other than myself. And that, as you deepen this intentionality and this attention, you start to broaden and deepen your own sense of presence. There's a paradox here. The less I try, the more I am. Do you see that? The less I try, the more I am. It doesn't mean you become passive or don't do anything. It's that you stop worrying about how that thing is going to work for you or how this compliment is going to be perceived by the person you offered it to. It doesn't mean you don't offer the compliment. All right. So White goes on to say, John O'Donohue, I told you his friend who's now dead, used to say that one of the necessary tasks of this radical letting alone of yourself in the world, letting the world speak in its own voice and letting this deeper sense of yourself speak out. Letting the world, do you see how his experience of the world is personal? It's not a rock or a shrub or an animal. It's something that has life. You can put that name on it, rock, shrub, animal. But merely the fact that you put the name on it doesn't mean you understand it or have completely encapsulated its meaning. This is the great challenge of language, right? We strive to name things, but there is a sense in naming it that we understand it or control it. Now, there is a way in which you find this to be helpful, right? The Gerasene demoniac. Naming it, somehow we think we get control over the demons, but in most of the rest of life, it's not. It winds up shutting us down and not opening us up if we're not careful. One of the things we're most afraid of in silence is this death of the periphery. This is just what I've been saying about the ego and the dying of the ego and how it feels like our own death, because that's how we understand ourselves. But the truth is there's a deeper sense of self, a deeper awareness of our being, right? The way it's described in the wisdom traditions is it's the awareness that is watching you watch. The awareness that is watching you watch. Right? That may not resonate with you right away or ever. But the sense is the deeper you get into yourself, the more you start to sense a presence beyond what you have known. And it is that deeper presence that the wisdom traditions have described as God, the creative part of the world. All right, so I'm going to try here to close out the section on David White by letting you listen to his poem. So his poem is Everything is Waiting for You. Does everybody have a copy of that? Who does not? Just raise your hand.
Really fierce loss, the loss of someone who's close to you, the loss of a mother, a father, a brother, a sister, a friend, God forbid, a child, then
I can't hear you. All right. So can you fix it?
And I'm going to draw up the rules, and I'm not coming out to this frontier again. I don't want to, you know.
Yeah, that's just this one. Yeah, okay. There's nothing like standing before a crowd with technology to lose your ego. All right. So I'm thinking this is Thank you, Jake. But I can't paint either, so I don't know. All right. Well, he's got a wonderful voice. Let me
Start
try it.
close in.
No, this is a different poem. All right. On YouTube, you can find it and listen to his voice. This is the tea kettle in the poem. All right, here it is. Just pretend there's this wonderful Irish accent that you're hearing. He says, your great mistake is to act the drama as if you were alone. Your great mistake is to act the drama as if you were alone, as if life were a progressive and cunning crime with no witness to the tiny, hidden transgressions. To feel abandoned is to deny the intimacy of your surroundings. Surely even you at times have felt the great array, the swelling presence in the chorus crowding out your solo voice. You must note the way the soap dish enables you, or the window latch grants you freedom. Alertness is the hidden discipline of familiarity. Alertness is the hidden discipline of familiarity. The stairs are your mentors of things to come. The doors have always been there to frighten you and invite you. And the tiny speaker in your phone is your dream ladder to divinity. Put down the weight of your aloneness and ease into the conversation. The kettle is singing even as it pours you a drink. The cooking pots have left their arrogant aloofness and seen the good in you at last. All the birds and creatures of the world are unutterably themselves. Everything is waiting for you. I could do and have in fact done entire classes on this poem, but note how all of the things that he describes can be life-giving and life-taking. I like the things about the pots finally recognizing you. But nevertheless, whatever it is, there's a sense that he has discovered an aliveness in all these otherwise inanimate objects that make his world come alive, that grant him freedom. But to do that, he had to develop an openness so that he could see it. And poetry, of course, is the perfect medium for it, because to personalize it seems normal in order to bring it to life. Well, I invite you to look that up on YouTube and listen to him read it. All right. Well, we are coming to the end, but I do want to shift into what I'll address next time, and that is, we've talked about how we know what we know, and I've tried to give you a sense of how the spiritual life fits into that and what it has to do with our faith. But when we walk out into the world, what problems does that solve? Is that just a matter of our own personal development, or is there more? And what I've settled on is isolation. Because it seems to me that so much about what we're encountering in the world and reading about in the world that we would describe as wrong has isolation at its root or as its consequence. Are you with me? So if true knowing is an interpersonal relationship with another person or thing, isolation is the absence of that relationship. And what does it do to us to not be in relationship? If our business as a church is to be in relationship, how can that help the world learn how to do that? So this is Mary Hunter, my wife, and I took a training in a course called Being With that we'll offer in the fall, not during this hour. But this is the video for that training out of St. Martin in the Fields in England, in London. And I think it does a wonderful job of highlighting this particular problem.
Our real human problem is isolation. Many people believe our problem is limitation. Not enough resources, information, wisdom. But if we think the problem is isolation, what we need is all around us. It's all about relationships.
Being with creates opportunities to make significant relationships. Through those relationships, we realize the truth we already know and discover truth through the experience of others. The truth about everything, what lasts forever, is most often called God. We get near to this truth in the depth of relationships we have with others, ourselves, and the natural world.
Through these relationships, we discover who God is and who we are. We experience moments of wonder, in which we realize the truth that is already within our own life experience.
Most people who join us on this journey have an experience of getting to know God. But everyone finds it a profound experience of getting to know others and themselves.
There are no wrong answers here. No anxiety to fix you. No attempt to make you into something you're not.
How you're feeling is as significant as what you're thinking.
Each person is celebrated.
We invite you to enter this journey of relationship for yourself. We call this being with.
We're all yours. So the question is all this speaking to those who are more introverted than extroverted? Well, what does the class think? Both? Can you say more about why? Mm-hmm.
From physical disabilities and limited lifestyle. And I had forgotten about one until we got together once, and I've been sending her weekly notes, and now we're starting to phone each other. And that means so much to me. And another one, my baby sister is suffering from Alzheimer's, and she doesn't remember my phone calls. So again, I'm sending her weekly notes, and she appreciates them because it's something physical as well as emotional. And it's a connection. And I'm finding COVID, I heard from high school friends and just reconnecting. I mean, it isolated us, but I think a lot of us were reaching out, especially ones like me, because I felt that need to share. I'm an avid gardener, and that's totally sharing. It's totally being at peace with God in special ways. And I just feel that value. And my husband looks towards me for his reaching out, which I think is helpful.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you. Other thoughts?
It seems like, the contemplative way is perhaps not a way that's as familiar to many of us in our upbringing, but I would suggest that service or serving is another way of being away from yourself that perhaps feels maybe a little more, congruous with our background, in my traditional faith background, I would say. And I think it accomplishes the same thing. I mean, you can be away from yourself as you're gazing at the lotus, and that's maybe an introvert way of, getting outside of yourself and connecting. But I think just in serving, maybe that's more of a feminine role, perhaps. But in just serving others, I think accomplishes sort of the same thing. Mm-hmm. And maybe that's a more familiar way to many of us.
Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah, no, thank you. So, did anybody else want to say anything before I respond to this? Yeah.
so much fun, but often you feel like, oh, sorry. But often people can be engaging and yet not be as present in the moment. Hearing and listening, it's like that difference in looking and seeing. So I'm not sure it is the question of introvert and extrovert. Mm-hmm. It is being able to make yourself be still enough that you're in that moment with whomever.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So like I enjoy social engagement as much as my extroverted husband, whereas it energizes him on the back end. I need to take a nap. Right. So I don't know if that's helpful, but I feel like we all want connection. It's just maybe the cost.
Yeah, or where you get your energy from.
Right.
Yes. Did everybody hear that? Defining introvert and extrovert, which is kind of how Myers-Briggs defines it. Where it's not about your ability to manage a cocktail party. It's about the energy it takes for you to manage a cocktail party. So there are some of us who get energized by being at the cocktail party, and others of us who, after a little while, kind of say, honey, I'm going home. You know. So maybe that's helpful to the distinction. It's not just about gregariousness, it's about the fueling of the gregariousness. Other thoughts? Yes.
It's the connection to inanimate objects like the kettle and the pot.
Right.
God in the kettle and the pot. I'm not there yet.
Yeah.
But I'm open to it. No, but is it there's a spark in the kettle and the pot?
What do you think? I mean, what I've said to you is everything I say, I want you to judge by whether you can find it in your own life. So if you can't find that aliveness in the kettle or the pot, then just don't worry about that.
Well, if I'm missing something, I want to try.
No, I think that what I think is really going on is for the last 300 years, we've decided it wasn't there. And so we were all raised in an environment that says that's fantastic and mystical and ridiculous. And the kettle is there to boil water. And the stone is there to build a building. And they have no independent value, right? But that's not the way people understood it for thousands of years before that. But don't get hung up on that, because what I believe is that as we open ourselves to things, and I'm going to come back to the service distinction, the world's going to appear differently to us. And it's an incremental progress. And if that's 3 steps, don't worry about that. God is also present right where you are, right? We have plenty of things we know we need to do. So don't be worried about the rock. All right, yes.
The kettle and the pot in the poem made me think about when you were teaching about C.S. Lewis's book, Surprised by Joy. And an example that you used numerous times when you were teaching that class was that you could find a moment of joy even in like the warm water in the shower in the morning. Hopefully that rings a bell. Yeah. But so in these sort of everyday moments and like a kettle that provides you the warm water for the tea that you enjoy drinking, or, you know, a moment of joy that maybe has a connection to God some way.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. That is, by the way, is when I see people and when I'm sitting with people who are really lost in deep pain or suffering, that's typically what I advise. Find the very smallest thing that provides some pleasure, some joy, and start there. Because you need to remind yourself that life exists. Because I think you've been isolated, right? So when I go to a hospital room with somebody suffering, I'm not there because I've got answers or a way to proceed. I'm there so they know they're not alone. I'm there so there's somebody else who's breathing beside them. And that connection is enough for them to find some spirit and some strength, I think. So, yeah. All right. Let me go back to, just so I don't lose it entirely, contemplation and service. So the way I'm using, so thank you for that. The way I'm using the term contemplation, it's not, it's a way of being in the world, not a commitment to silence. A way of being in the world, not a commitment to silence. So contemplation without service is empty. And I would argue that service without contemplation is equally empty. And the example I would offer is what we've learned about outreach service just in the last generation, right? Where we, now the phrase we use is, don't do for me without me. Does that resonate? Don't do for me without me. So we no longer go wandering into poor neighborhoods thinking we know what to do and just bring some money and do it. We now know that's actually corrosive and unhelpful. And I would argue, back to my theme, that's because, well-intended, it's not because we were stupid. We had a whole lot of smart people that did this all across the world in various cultures, right? But what we didn't do was be with those people. And so now we know, we know what we were missing? Wisdom. That's what we were missing. And there are some people, we did one to this guy in Africa, I'll bring him back, but who had this whole epiphany about the importance of being with before providing service in order to know what to do. And then was able to do what needed to be done in those communities. My daughter, my oldest child, is up in North Carolina, and her job is to go into under-resourced communities and try to help them develop their own foundations, their own base, their own economic base, their own spiritual base, but to help them do it themselves. And there's a whole science around how you do that. I would argue that is contemplative and service at the same time. So Richard Rohr's organization, for example, in Albuquerque, is contemplation and action. Contemplation and action. And he argues, I think, persuasively, that one without the other is a waste of time. So yes, I think we are more used to doing stuff. And I think that's exactly right. But I think there's an opportunity for us to do it with some space where it would be even more valuable. And and how we do that doesn't have to be centering prayer. That's why I'm, to your point. So yeah, thank you for that. All right. Well, let me give you a little bit there were some hands up over here, I guess. You good? All right. So let me give you, I'll tell you a little bit about our experience with this course later. This is David Brooks, as you know, and he's got a new book. David Brooks wrote The Road to Character and The Second Mountain, right? He writes a lot about virtue ethics, almost like a broken record, but he's really good. And I like him, actually. Here's his new book. It'll be out in October, so you don't have to read it now. How do you know a person? The art of seeing others deeply and being deeply seen. Right? So this is the theme. I don't know how he found out I was doing this. But, what I'm trying to say is we're not acting in isolation from a lot of different quarters of people who are worried about how we are with each other and where society finds its spiritual grounding and how we deal with poverty and violence and isolation and illness and partisan politics is an understanding that we've got to learn how to be in relationship with each other. And so it's not just introvert, extrovert, it's also structural impediments, right? Structures in society that keep us separated. I got a call yesterday from a woman who was out at Forsyth. She's a Towers resident. Her daughter-in-law called from Chicago. She was going downhill in Cumming, and nobody knew where she was, and this woman wanted us to go see her and take her communion, right? Because she knew that her mother-in-law needed to be reconnected to her spiritual home in order to die. She knew that. So Julia, who's a saint, dropped her whole life, maybe one or two children, I'm sure Jack was great about it, and drove to Cumming in order to take communion to this woman, right? Why are we doing that? Because we're re-entering relationship with her, because it's life-giving. So it's not a complicated philosophy, really. It's just about learning how to be in relationship with other people and be present to them. And you will experience God in those moments. That's the promise. And learning how we know what we know can guide us into serving more effectively, right? Guide us into guiding people in suffering more effectively because we learn how to be more present. All right, my final closing comment is that this is our Surgeon General, and he has a wonderful interview with Krista Tippett on being, which this is his book together, The Healing Power of Human Connection in a Sometimes Lonely World. I think that is in the bookstore, but I recommend it to you. And I was going to play you a meditation that he offers. We don't have time, but I do recommend you go on Being and listen to his interview with Krista Tippett, which is not long, but you'll get a sense of how the nation's doctor looks at loneliness and the structural barriers to our being in relationship with each other and calls for us to learn how to love each other. Okay? This is our top doctor, the Surgeon General. All right, go in peace to love and serve the Lord.